Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to pull on a single thread that connects a devastating drug epidemic, a secret war, and a global financial crisis.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking. A drug epidemic, a secret war, a financial crisis? How are these possibly connected? Well, on the surface, they're not. But we're about to see how a secret war fought in Central America was paid for with cocaine money, which was only possible because of a global debt crisis, which then unleashed a drug explosion right on American streets.
Okay, so our story kicks off on the streets of Los Angeles in the early 1980s. This was ground zero for a public health crisis that was about to go completely national.
So before the 80s, you got to understand cocaine was, well, it was a luxury item. The Dom Perignon of drugs, right? Expensive, exclusive. But then, as journalist Gary Webb detailed, something changed. And it wasn't just a new drug, it was a brilliant, if terrifying marketing move. See, dealers figured out that by simply cooking powder cocaine with baking soda, you get crack. It's cheap, it's potent, it's incredibly addictive, and just like that, a luxury good turned into a mass-market commodity. Overnight.
And the speed, my gosh, the speed at which this thing blew up was just insane. This wasn't a slow creep, it was an absolute explosion. You see rock cocaine pop up in '81. Just a year later, ER visits are skyrocketing. By '84, it's a full-blown open-air business. And then just 2 years after that, Newsweek is calling it a national crisis, and they're pointing right at LA as ground zero.
But wait a minute. That kind of speed, that kind of scale, it just begs a question, right? To have a mass market, you need a mass supply chain. So where on earth did all of this cheap cocaine suddenly come from?
And this is where the work of journalist Gary Webb is so crucial. His investigation for the San Jose Mercury News basically followed the drugs backward, from the streets of LA all the way to a secret war in Central America. And his trail started with the man at the very top of the LA crack empire.
Freeway Rick Ross. This guy wasn't just some corner dealer. He was a genuine street capitalist who built a massive distribution network. But here's the thing, even a kingpin like Ross needs a wholesaler, right? He needs someone with access to a seemingly bottomless well of cheap product. And the identity of his supplier? Well, this is where the story just goes completely off the rails.
So who was it? Get this. Ross's main guy was a man named Danilo Blandon. And he wasn't some cartel boss from Colombia. Nope, he was a wealthy Nicaraguan exile and a leader in the FDN. The main Contra Army. Yeah, that Contra Army. The one secretly created and funded by the CIA to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. The question becomes screamingly obvious. What is a CIA-backed political figure doing supplying LA's biggest crack deal?
Well, we don't even have to guess. In a U.S. courtroom under oath, Blandon laid it all out himself. He said, and I quote, "There's a purpose for it. Whatever we were running in LA, the profit was going to the Contra Revolution. We were in charge to get some money to fight the communists." I mean, there it is, right from the source. It was a dark alliance, American drug money for an American-backed secret war.
Okay, but that just opens up another, even bigger question, doesn't it? Why would a CIA-backed army get so desperate for cash that they'd resort to selling cocaine? To answer that, we have to pull the camera way, way back from the streets of LA and look at an economic firestorm that was engulfing the entire continent of Latin America.
According to economist Jose Antonio Ocampo, Latin America in the 1980s was caught in this brutal economic vice. Imagine this. The interest rates on the massive loans they owed to foreign banks were shooting through the roof. At the exact same time, the prices they were getting for their exports, the things they sell to pay those debts, were plummeting. It was an absolute recipe for disaster.
And here's the number that explains why Washington was paying such close attention: 180%. That's how much of the capital of the 9 largest U.S. banks was tied up in Latin American loans. Think about that. A widespread default in Latin America wouldn't just be their problem. It threatened to take down the entire U.S. banking system.
And that fear changed everything. See, back in the 1930s, countries were generally allowed to default. But in the 1980s, no way. The top priority was saving the banks. So Latin American nations were forced into these brutal austerity programs. This plunged the continent into what became known as the lost decade of economic collapse.
And that created the perfect conditions of instability and desperation for black market economies to just thrive.
So let's recap. We've got a drug epidemic, a secret war, and a global debt crisis. 3 seemingly separate stories. But philosopher Leif Wenner offers one simple, powerful idea that connects them all. It's this concept called the resource curse. You've probably heard of it, this paradox that countries with tons of natural resources often suffer from dictators and conflict. But Wenner argues it's not a curse at all. It's what happens when we fail to enforce one of the most basic rules of a modern state, that a country's resources belong to its people. When a dictator or a warlord seizes those resources and sells them, they are, plain and simple, stealing from their own citizens. Wenner's point comes alive with a simple analogy. Imagine you walk into a high-end store and buy a Rolex. That's a good faith purchase. Now, what if you buy that same watch from a guy in a trench coat on a street corner? That's a bad faith purchase. You know it's probably stolen. Wenner argues the same principle applies to nations. When foreign buyers purchase resources, oil from a dictator or drug profits from a rebel army, from a regime that lacks popular consent, they are knowingly receiving stolen goods.
And now, all the threads come together. You see, the crack epidemic wasn't some isolated, random event. It was a direct consequence of this tragic intersection of global forces.
So here's the tragic connection. Wiener gives us the theory. Selling a nation's resources without consent is theft. Webb gives us the case study. The Contras, an unelected army selling cocaine to fund their war. And Ocampo provides the context, a debt crisis that created the instability to make it all possible. And the result? Devastation on multiple continents. And look, this story doesn't just come from journalists and academics. Years later, the CIA's own Inspector General testified to Congress that the agency knew some of its Contra allies were trafficking drugs inside the U.S. and chose not to cut them off. It was a tacit admission that, in the pursuit of a foreign policy goal, they turned a blind eye to a flood of drugs pouring into American communities.
And this leaves us with a really challenging final thought. This isn't just a story about the 1980s. It's a question about today. If a nation's wealth, be it oil, diamonds, or even drug profits, truly belongs to its people, what is the responsibility of those of us who buy it on the global market knowing it was stolen? What is our role in that chain?